King Charles finally puts his foot down. He will not be reconciling with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle after making a major announcement regarding his cancer improvement.
What if I told you that this morning the British Parliament did something it hasn't done in over 300 years? Something so constitutionally explosive that even the Speaker's hands trembled as he announced the result? At 11:43 a.m. today, Westminster crossed a line that changed everything. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle have just been formally exiled from Britain, and the shockwaves, they've only just begun. But here's what nobody saw coming. This wasn't a sudden decision. This was calculated, deliberate, and it had been planned in absolute secrecy for months. So how did we get here? What happened behind those closed doors? And more importantly, what happens next? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you see the British monarchy forever. The vote that shattered everything. Picture this: the House of Commons, usually rowdy, combative, filled with the theatrical arguments we've come to expect from British politics. But today was different. The chamber fell silent in a way that happens perhaps once in a generation. Members of Parliament sat frozen, not debating, not jeering, just waiting. The Speaker of the House stood at the dispatch box. His voice, typically steady, authoritative, trembled slightly, and then he read the numbers that would change royal history forever. 347 votes in favor, 216 against. The motion to formally exile Prince Harry and Meghan Markle from British soil had passed. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the chamber erupted, not with cheers or celebration, but with something far more unsettling. A low murmur that spread like wildfire through the benches, a collective exhale of disbelief mixed with grim satisfaction. Can you imagine being in that room? Can you feel the weight of what just happened? Outside in the cold December air, reporters who had been stationed at Westminster since dawn began shouting into their phones. Within 90 seconds, every major news outlet on the planet had broken into regular programming. For years, American commentators had suggested Britain was too polite, too bound by tradition to take drastic action. Today proved them catastrophically wrong. But here's what makes this vote so devastating. It wasn't the outcome, it was the speed. Think about this. The motion had been introduced only 6 days earlier, debated behind closed doors for 72 hours, brought to the floor with almost no public warning. That alone violated nearly every convention of parliamentary procedure. Exile motions, when they exist at all in modern history, take months of deliberation. This one moved like a guillotine, swift, efficient, and final. Why the rush? What were they afraid of? The choreographed absence. Here's where it gets interesting. While Parliament was voting, where was the royal family? King Charles was attending a private engagement in Scotland. Prince William was at Windsor, his schedule carefully cleared. Princess Anne was in Edinburgh. Notice the pattern. The entire senior royal family had positioned themselves away from London. A choreographed absence that spoke louder than any statement could. This wasn't coincidence. This was strategy. By removing themselves from London, they ensured they could not be accused of directly influencing Parliament. They created plausible deniability. But make no mistake, this vote happened
to do some form of therapy, or at least be able to talk more about,
with their full knowledge and quiet endorsement. And the most telling reaction? It came from those who pushed hardest for this outcome. Senior Conservative MPs, many representing constituencies where public anger toward the Sussexes had grown toxic, expressed quiet relief rather than triumph. One backbencher, speaking anonymously, said simply, "This wasn't about punishment, it was about survival. The monarchy cannot function while two of its former members wage war from abroad." That phrase, wage war, would dominate headlines for the rest of the day. But what about Harry and Meghan? Where were they when their world collapsed? The California Awakening. Across the Atlantic in Montecito, California, the Sussexes were waking to a nightmare they had been warned about but refused to believe was possible. According to sources close to their circle, Meghan saw the alert first. She had been checking her phone during breakfast when the breaking news banner appeared. For several seconds, she simply stared. Then she handed the phone to Harry without saying a word. Why the silence? Not because the vote was surprising, but because it was real, irreversible, final. Think about that moment. Everything they'd built, everything they'd assumed would always be available to them, gone in an instant. The legal implications hit like a freight train. First, both Harry and Meghan would be prohibited from entering the United Kingdom for a minimum of 10 years, with potential extensions subject to parliamentary review. Second, any attempt to return would result in immediate arrest and deportation. Third, their British properties, including Frogmore Cottage, would be seized by the Crown Estate. Fourth, their remaining ceremonial titles, already stripped of function, would be formally nullified. Fifth, even their children, Archie and Lilibet,
I can safely say from my experience and all the travelling that I've done,
would face restrictions on travel to Britain until they reached adulthood and could petition independently. Let that sink in for a moment. Their children, grandchildren of King Charles, great-grandchildren of Queen Elizabeth, banned from the country that defines their heritage. By noon, Buckingham Palace released a statement so brief it felt almost cruel. The matter is one for Parliament and the government. The royal family will continue to focus on its duties. 21 words. That's all the royal family felt Harry deserved. But here's the question nobody's asking. How did we actually get here? The secret meetings that led here. The first indication that something unprecedented was forming came in early November. A small group of MPs received invitations to a private briefing at the Cabinet Office. The meeting was listed in official logs as a security consultation, vague enough to avoid media attention. Who attended? Senior members of the Home Affairs Committee, representatives from the intelligence services, constitutional advisors whose expertise lay in the murky intersection of monarchy and state power. What they were shown that evening changed everything. Intelligence reports compiled over the previous 8 months detailed a pattern of activity that alarmed even those accustomed to Sussex controversies. The briefing included evidence of coordinated media campaigns aimed at undermining specific members of the royal family, particularly Catherine. Financial relationships between Sussex-affiliated PR firms and outlets known for spreading misinformation and communications suggesting Harry and Meghan's team had been in contact with foreign media organizations to discuss documentary projects that would destabilize the institution from abroad. None of this was illegal in the traditional sense, but for a nation where the monarchy functions as a constitutional cornerstone, the implications were severe. One MP present at the briefing later described the atmosphere as like a funeral. We weren't dealing with tabloid drama anymore, he said off the record. We were looking at something that could fracture the relationship between Crown and Parliament if left unchecked. Think about what that means. This wasn't about hurt feelings or family drama. This was about national security. The second meeting occurred 3 weeks later, this time at a secure location within Westminster itself. By now, the circle had widened to include senior figures from both major parties. Stop right there. When was the last time you saw British politicians from different parties agree on anything controversial? But the Sussex situation had transcended regular political divisions. This was now a constitutional threat. And here's where Prince William enters the story. William's invisible hand. William played a role in this process, though his involvement was carefully insulated from direct visibility. He didn't attend meetings, he didn't lobby MPs personally, but his private secretary delivered a series of briefings to key parliamentary figures, outlining the palace's concerns, and critically, making clear that the royal family would not oppose a legislative solution. Without that signal, Parliament would never have dared move forward. Think about what William O'Reilly did here. His own brother, the person he grew up with, played with, grieved with after their mother's death. And William gave Parliament permission to exile him. How cold do you have to be to make that calculation? Princess Anne contributed in her own way. During a private dinner with several senior cabinet ministers in late November, she made a remark that one attendee described as chilling in its clarity. Institutions survive, she said, by knowing when to amputate. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Everyone present understood that she was speaking about Harry and Meghan, and that the royal family, historically cautious about direct political engagement, was now quietly endorsing the most extreme option available. But the real turning point came in early December. The intelligence report. A subcommittee investigating foreign influence operations issued a report. Buried in it, almost as a footnote, was a mention of British nationals engaged in media activities that could be interpreted as destabilizing the constitutional structures of a key ally. The report didn't name Harry and Meghan explicitly, but it landed on the desk of the British Home Secretary within hours of its release, and it changed the calculation entirely. What had been viewed as a domestic royal drama was now entangled with international relations and national security concerns. When foreign governments begin questioning whether former royals are acting in ways that complicate diplomatic relationships, the situation moves beyond tabloid fodder into territory that demands governmental response. The drafting of the exile motion began in absolute secrecy. A small team of parliamentary lawyers worked with constitutional historians to craft language that would withstand legal challenge. The precedent they relied on, dating back to 1703, when Parliament had last exercised its authority to formally banish individuals deemed threats to the realm's stability. The mechanism had never been used against royals, but it existed, and in Britain's unwritten constitution, existence is often enough. Can you imagine discovering laws from over 300 years ago still have the power to exile a prince? The final sign. By the first week of December, the motion was ready. But the decision to move quickly, to compress months of standard procedure into days, was strategic. Delay would mean leaks. Leaks would mean media firestorms, public pressure, and potential intervention by parties that could complicate the vote. Speed wasn't cruelty, it was survival. But the final sign that the vote was inevitable came when the palace made a decision that stunned even seasoned observers. King Charles authorized the release of private correspondence between himself and Harry, messages dating back 18 months that showed the king repeatedly warning his son about the consequences of continued public attacks on the family.
Han muss lång leva, lång mi, ikam lång juplad olgete.
Think about that betrayal. A father releasing his son's private letters to justify his exile. That release, orchestrated through carefully selected journalists, dramatically shifted public sentiment. Polls conducted in the 48 hours before the vote showed a sharp increase in support for intense parliamentary action. Older voters, particularly those over 50, expressed overwhelming approval. Even among younger demographics, previously more sympathetic to the Sussexes, support for exile measures reached 42%. By the morning of the vote, The outcome was no longer in doubt. Only the margin remained. And when that margin proved larger than even optimistic projections had suggested, it sent a message not just to Harry and Meghan, but to anyone watching from abroad. Britain had finally reached its limit. What Harry and Meghan didn't see coming. Throughout late autumn, sources close to the Sussexes described a household operating under the belief that their position was secure. Meghan, in particular, seemed confident that public opinion, especially in America, would shield them from any serious consequences. She had built a narrative over 3 years that positioned them as victims of an archaic racist institution. That narrative had resonated powerfully with specific demographics: younger Americans, progressive media outlets, social justice advocates. But what she failed to account for was this: narratives, no matter how compelling, eventually collide with reality. Harry's position was more complicated. Unlike Meghan, he had grown up inside the system. He understood its mechanisms, its pressures, its capacity for coldness when threatened. Yet somewhere along the way, that understanding had curdled into contempt. Friends who knew him before his marriage described a man who had always chafed against royal constraints, but never truly believed the institution would turn on him. He was born royal. That, he thought, granted him permanent immunity. He was catastrophically wrong. The first missed warning came in October, when several of their key media allies in Britain began quietly stepping back from coverage of the Sussexes. These weren't tabloids or hostile outlets. These were journalists who had previously championed the couple, written sympathetic profiles, defended them against criticism. But one by one, they started declining interview requests, pulling back from Sussex-related stories, and in some cases privately expressing concern that the narrative had become too toxic to touch. Why would supportive journalists suddenly abandon them? One such journalist, speaking months later under condition of anonymity, explained the shift. "We started hearing things from inside Parliament, not rumors, but concrete information that something significant was being discussed. And when you're a reporter who values access, you have to make calculations." Continuing to champion Harry and Meghan meant risking relationships with sources inside government and the palace. For many of us, that trade-off no longer made sense. The rats were leaving the ship, but Harry and Meghan didn't notice. The warnings they ignored. The second warning arrived in the form of legal communications. In early November, Harry's British legal team received a formal notification from the Home Office requesting clarification on several points related to his residency status, security arrangements, and ongoing litigation against UK media outlets. The language was bureaucratic, almost mundane, but the subtext was clear. The government was reviewing his standing, and the review was not routine. How did Harry respond? He instructed his lawyers to push back aggressively, treating the inquiry as another example of institutional harassment. Meghan encouraged this approach. She viewed any sign of retreat as validation of the palace's tactics. What neither of them understood was that the Home Office inquiry wasn't harassment. It was preparation. The government was laying groundwork for actions that would require detailed legal justification, and Harry's combative response only made the eventual outcome easier to defend.
It happened a few weeks ago, earlier this month, here at our cottage.
The third warning should have been impossible to miss. In late November, William authorized a rare interview with a senior political correspondent. The interview, ostensibly about his increased royal duties, included a single line that went largely unnoticed by the general public, but sent shockwaves among those who understood royal communication. There comes a point when protecting the institution requires difficult decisions that previous generations avoided. He didn't mention Harry. He didn't need to. Everyone knew exactly what he meant. Yet in California, the reaction was dismissal. Meghan told friends that William was posturing trying to appear decisive for a British public that was losing faith in the monarchy's relevance. Harry seemed to interpret the comment as further evidence of his brother's ambition and willingness to sacrifice family for power. Neither of them considered the possibility that William wasn't threatening. He was informed. The decision had already been made. The gears were already turning, and Harry and Meghan were about to be crushed. The response that sealed their fate. Here's where it gets truly stunning. In late November, as the final pieces were falling into place, a back-channel communication was attempted. An intermediary, someone trusted by both sides, reached out to the Sussexes with a simple message. Stop, just stop the attacks. Issue a statement committing to silence on royal matters. Give Parliament a reason not to act. It was their final off-ramp, their last chance to avoid catastrophe. Harry and Meghan's response was delivered through their PR team. They would not be silenced. They would not apologize for speaking the truth. And they would not negotiate with a system designed to suppress them. The intermediary, upon receiving this response,
to do some form of therapy, or at least be able to talk more about.
Reportedly closed the communication channel and told associates they have no idea what's coming. Can you imagine that hubris? Being offered one last chance to save yourself and responding with defiance? On the morning of December 3rd, as MPs filed into Westminster to cast their votes, Harry and Meghan were in California, operating under the assumption that this was simply another chapter in an ongoing drama. When the vote passed, the shock was absolute. Not because they hadn't known emotion existed. By that point, rumors had reached even their carefully controlled information bubble, but because they had convinced themselves it would fail, that Britain, for all its bluster, would never actually exile a prince and his American wife, that the international embarrassment would be too great, that Charles, despite everything, would intervene on his son's behalf. They were wrong on every count. The constitutional earthquake. What happened in Westminster on December 3rd was not merely political theater. It was a constitutional event of a magnitude that legal scholars will debate for decades. The vote to exile Harry and Meghan activated mechanisms that most people assumed had been relegated to history books, dusted off from centuries past, and applied to two individuals who had crossed a line no modern royal had dared approach. The legal foundation for the exile rests on a peculiar feature of British constitutional law. Unlike nations with written constitutions that clearly delineate powers, Britain operates on a system of parliamentary sovereignty combined with centuries of precedent. This means that, in theory, Parliament can pass almost any law it chooses, provided it can muster the votes. The statute they invoked, originally designed to address threats to the realm during periods of political instability. It granted Parliament the authority to banish individuals whose actions were deemed incompatible with the nation's security and constitutional stability. Modern legal interpretation had assumed such powers were defunct, overridden by contemporary human rights framework. The December vote proved otherwise. The Home Office moved with extraordinary speed to implement the decision. Within 6 hours of the vote, formal notices were dispatched to Harry and Meghan through their legal representatives. The documents, running to 47 pages, outlined the precise terms of their exile. Entry into the United Kingdom was prohibited for a minimum period of 10 years. Any attempt to enter, by any means, would result in immediate detention and forcible removal. Their British passports, though not technically revoked, were flagged in international databases, alerting immigration officials worldwide to their status. Property seizure followed with equal efficiency. Frogmore Cottage was formally reclaimed by the Crown Estate before sunset. Personal belongings were catalogued, packed, and placed in secure storage, pending arrangements for international shipping. Security stripping proved more complex. all security provisions were terminated with immediate effect. More significantly, intelligence sharing between British and American security services regarding threats against the Sussexes was suspended. Can you imagine waking up one morning with full royal security and by sunset being completely on your own? The royal family's cold silence. Inside Buckingham Palace, the hours following the parliamentary vote unfolded with a stillness that felt almost rehearsed. No emergency meetings, no frantic phone calls, no visible crisis management. Staff moved through their routines with the precision of people who had been prepared for this outcome long before it arrived. And in the private apartments where the senior royals resided, the response was marked not by shock, but by something far more unsettling: relief. King Charles remained in Scotland throughout the day, his schedule unchanged.
So whatever faith you have, or whether you have none, it is in this life-giving light.
He attended a planned visit to a Highland community project, spoke briefly with local officials, and returned to Balmoral by late afternoon. Those who observed him noted no visible distress, no moments of hesitation. His face carried the same composed exhaustion it had worn for months. If he grieved for his son, he did so behind doors no staff member would dare approach. But Charles's silence was deliberate, crafted in consultation with advisors who understood that any public emotion would be weaponized. If he expressed sorrow, he would be accused of weakness. If he showed relief, he would be condemned as cruel. So, he said nothing. William's response was colder still. He spent the day at Windsor, working through a revised schedule of engagements that would now fall more heavily on his shoulders. When a private secretary brought news of the vote's final tally, William reportedly nodded once, said nothing, and returned to the document he had been reviewing. For him, the exile was not a family tragedy. It was a problem solved. The monarchy could not function while Harry and Meghan lobbied attacks from California. Now, finally, there was clarity. Princess Anne spent the day in Edinburgh, attending to her royal duties with the same relentless efficiency she brought to every task. When asked by a member of her staff how she felt about the parliamentary decision, Anne offered a response that would later leak to the press. Institutions endure by making hard choices. Today, Parliament made 1. She did not elaborate. She rarely did. But the message was unmistakable. Anne viewed the exile not as punishment, but as necessity. The 29-word statement, the palace's official statement, released at 2:30 p.m., was remarkable only for its brevity. The matter decided by Parliament today is a constitutional question outside the scope of royal commentary. The family's focus remains on service to the nation. No mention of Harry by name, no expression of regret or support, just a clinical acknowledgement that the situation had been removed from the family's domain and placed squarely in the hands of the state. Think about that for a moment. Your son, your brother, your grandson, exiled, and you offer 29 words. But behind that public silence, private calculations were already underway. Charles's advisors began reviewing protocols for future succession planning, ensuring Harry's exile would not create legal ambiguities regarding the line of succession. William's team coordinated with government officials on messaging strategies, anticipating prolonged media focus on the family's role in enabling the parliamentary vote. And across all levels of the royal household, staff prepared for the inevitable backlash from Sussex supporters who would frame the exile as proof of institutional cruelty. International reactions complicated the silence. American media, particularly outlets sympathetic to the Sussexes, depicted the royal family as complicit in a medieval punishment. CNN ran segments questioning whether the British monarchy had any place in a modern democratic society. The New York Times published an op-ed arguing that the exile revealed the institution's inherent toxicity. For the palace, these attacks were expected, even anticipated. The strategy was simple: let the noise rage, offer no defense, and allow time to dull the outrage. Yet within this orchestrated silence, small cracks appeared. King Charles, during a private evening at Balmoral, was observed standing alone at a window overlooking the estate grounds, his expression unreadable. Was he thinking of Harry as a child? Of all the ways this could have been prevented, we'll never know. Prince William Turfau showed fleeting moments of something beneath his composed exterior. During a private conversation with Catherine, overheard accidentally by a staff member passing in the corridor, he reportedly said, "I didn't want it to come to this, but he left us no choice." It was the closest he came to expressing any ambivalence about the outcome, and even then, the emphasis was on necessity, not regret. The long shadow ahead. As the winter sun set over Montecito on December 3rd, Harry and Meghan faced a future more uncertain than any moment since their departure from royal life. The exile vote had not simply closed a door, it had sealed an entire corridor of possibilities they had assumed would always remain open. No matter how hostile the relationship became, they had believed, on some level, that return was always an option. That belief died at 11:43 that morning in Westminster. The immediate practical consequences were staggering. Travel became complicated in ways they hadn't anticipated. Harry's flagged status meant that every international border crossing would now involve additional scrutiny. Countries with extradition agreements or close intelligence cooperation with Britain might view him as a security complication. Financial pressures, already significant, intensified. The couple's income model had relied heavily on their royal connection, their ability to tell insider stories, their positioning as truth-tellers, exposing institutional dysfunction. But exile changed the narrative equation. They were no longer brave whistleblowers. They were exiled former royals, a category that historically generates more pity than profit. Netflix, Spotify, and other media partners would need to reassess whether the Sussex brand still carried the commercial value it once did. For their children, the implications stretched across decades. Both held dual citizenship, American and British. But the exile order, while not legally binding on them, created a chilling effect. Would they be welcomed in Britain as adults? Would their parents' status cast a permanent shadow over them? Could they build relationships with cousins, with grandparents, with the extended family they had been photographed with as infants, but might never truly know? The psychological impact would reveal itself more slowly, but those who understood trauma recognized the signs immediately. Harry had spent 40 years defined by his royal identity, even when rebelling against it. That identity shaped his sense of purpose, his public role, his understanding of who he was in the world. Without Britain, without the palace, without the institution he spent years attacking, who was he? Meghan's dilemma. Meghan's position was different, but no less complicated. She had entered the royal family as an outsider, endured treatment she described as racist and cruel, and built a second act around exposing that treatment. The exile could be framed, in certain circles, as vindication, proof that the institution was exactly as toxic as she had claimed. But that narrative had limits. Exile also meant failure, an inability to navigate a system that, however flawed, many women before her had managed to survive. And in Hollywood, where success matters more than righteousness, failure is rarely forgiven. International implications extended beyond the couple themselves. The United States government, maintaining public neutrality, faced quiet pressure from British diplomats to limit Sussex activities that could be interpreted as hostile to an allied nation. While outright restrictions were unlikely, the message was clear. If Harry and Meghan continued producing content attacking the British monarchy or government, there would be diplomatic consequences. Soft power has limits, even for American citizens married to exiled princes. The possibility that remains. Yet within this bleak landscape, one possibility remained, not as royals, not as victims, but as something entirely new. History offered rare examples of public figures who survived exile and built meaningful second acts. But those success stories required something Harry and Meghan had not yet demonstrated: the ability to stop looking backward. Could they reinvent themselves? Could they find purpose beyond their grievances? Or would they spend the next decade locked in a battle they could never win? For the British monarchy, the long-term implications were equally uncertain. The exile had solved an immediate problem. Harry and Meghan could no longer destabilize the institution from within its orbit, but it had created new vulnerabilities. International criticism of the decision was fierce and sustained. Younger generations, particularly outside Britain, viewed the exile as proof that the monarchy was outdated, vindictive, and incapable of evolving. Those perceptions would take years to shift, if they shifted at all. Prince William, now the unambiguous heir without a wayward brother complicating the succession narrative, faced a different kind of pressure. He would be judged not only on his own merits, but on whether the institution he would one day lead could justify the coldness it had displayed toward Harry. Every decision, every public appearance, every statement would be scrutinized through the lens of that severed relationship. The Crown had chosen survival over compassion. Whether that choice would ultimately strengthen or weaken the monarchy remained to be seen. The truth nobody wants to admit. As December deepened into the darkest days of winter, a truth settled over everyone touched by the exile vote. This was not an ending, it was a threshold, the beginning of a long, uncertain period during which Harry and Meghan would define who they could become without the identity they had spent years attacking but never fully released. And the monarchy would discover whether it could thrive in a world where exile, once a relic of history, had become a tool of modern constitutional governance. So let me ask you this: who do you think wins in this situation? Harry and Meghan, freed from the constraints of an institution they despised, or the royal family, finally rid of the chaos that threatened to consume them? The truth: nobody wins when a family destroys itself. But consequences, however long delayed, eventually arrive. And today, at 11:43 in the morning, those consequences became undeniable. The exile of Harry and Meghan is not simply a royal drama. It's a reminder that every action has a reaction. Every word has weight. Every bridge you burn might be one you desperately need to cross again someday. What do you think happens next? Will Harry and Meghan find peace in their exile? Or will this decision haunt the royal family for generations? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this analysis valuable, make sure to like and subscribe, because this story is far from over. The monarchy has spoken, Parliament has voted, and Harry and Meghan, they're about to discover what it truly means to be on the outside looking in. Thank you for watching.